We shouldn't have the highest unemployment rates where black people live. The only excuse for that is that they are robbing us of our opportunity to create wealth in our own community.
In this episode of Our Mississippi, we're passing the mic to State Representative Robert Johnson, who explains the racist history of gerrymandering, how it's suppressing the black vote now, and the reform that needs to happen to make voting equal and equitable for all.
Let's just say most 99% of African Americans are Democrats. We make up 38 to 39% of the population, but we suffer under the supermajority here in the state. We're not, we don't have any balance in our legislature. It allows people to be polarized, and instead of voting on issues that really affect people, they simply take a partisan position that's convenient and expedient, and that's not good for anybody. So we may not achieve a majority in the legislature, but if we can challenge and we can do away with some of this political gerrymandering, then it will allow us to achieve a greater balance than we have now and be able to be more effective for the people of the state of Mississippi. And I would argue it would make Republicans even more effective. The whole list of bills that we introduced to fix the problems with corrections, some of which I have here, some of which that said people who are serving a sentence of 5-year or less sentence who are convicted of a minor drug offense, that those people should be released. They should be put on parole, and in most cases, sentences commuted. We want to do away with, restore suffrage to people when their voting rights have been taken away. They've served their time. There's no reason for them to continue to suffer under that penalty that was orchestrated after Reconstruction at the turn of the century, the last century, in order to disenfranchise African American voters. We want to do that. We want to be able to, people that are released, there are people that are still in prison that are not released because they don't have homes to go to. We ought to have intermediate release centers. Instead of these 3 restitution centers that nobody's really using, those people ought to be able to be released there where they can work themselves back into society. Those kind of things. But in big issues, in terms of just policy, we look at the discrepancy in terms of economic development and job opportunity that you don't have in the Delta, which is majority African American, and Southwest Mississippi. That economic development effort is not seen, and the excuse is put forth that, well, they need more infrastructure, or their schools are not adequate, or there's not an educated workforce. Well, that's just a cop-out, because it's the chicken or the egg. Which one comes first? If you don't do something about those issues will always be a problem. But we've seen examples where even when you don't have an educated workforce and infrastructure, if you want to locate an industry there and create jobs, they build the roads and they educate the workforce. So all of that could be done, but if you had a balance of power in the legislature, you would find that we would be able to push more to make sure that happens in our areas. We shouldn't have the highest unemployment rates where black people live. The only excuse for that is that they are robbing us of our opportunity to create wealth in our own community. Those are the kind of things that if we could get more balance, we could do something about. We have a slew of bills that'll do everything we can to make it easier for people to vote. And they're bills that, in fact, have been introduced and passed in the U.S. House of Representatives, haven't been able to pass the Senate. But we're also hoping that in the House of Representatives, nationally, federally, that they're able to do some of these things. And some people call it a mandate, but require the state to pass these laws. And that's what we're hoping for. But in the meantime, we're going to introduce them here. We have introduced bills in the last 3, 4, 5 years for early voting, online registration, to make it easier for people to register to vote, make it easier for people to vote. Those things are very important too. So in Georgia, they were able to register more people, and they were able to register more people fast. Some of that lends itself to the fact that they have more urban areas and we have more rural areas. It's hard to get to people sometimes, but it's not impossible. But if we had less restrictive registration laws and less restrictive voting laws, we could do more about getting more people registered and having more people go to the polls. We won't have quite as much resistance. There'll be some resistance as we had before. I think there's some interest even among Republicans of creating more of a balance, because they can't continue to be subjected to this far right idea that because you're a Republican, you have to be all the way over here and doing all these weird things and supporting all these antique policies. So, and the fact that we've had this pandemic you can't argue that it makes sense to make it harder for people. People shouldn't have to stand in line. If you had early voting, people would be able to go to the polls at their choosing when it's not crowded. You could exercise social distancing. So it's hard for them to argue against those issues. But the other issue is that the governor has created such a chasm between himself and the legislature that there is a partnership that would not naturally be formed. But for instance, the House of Representatives, the Republicans and Democrats are working closer together because we are trying to fight the governor and his heavy-handedness. And so to the extent that we continue to do that, we may be able to get something. We were able to get some concessions during the pandemic CARES Act issues, and I hope it spreads itself on into general legislation.